It seems like it's become increasingly hard for NGOs to find ways of obtaining fundraising, and given the recent government cuts that are being implemented, how has your strategy, both in terms of raising funds for your own work and also campaigning for government initiatives, so for example, a greater connection between civil society and government development programs, changed over the last few years, or how do you envisage that strategy changing going forward? If there are any more questions that are in your minds right now, please raise your hand. Have you had a question?
Hi, thank you. I was just curious, you discussed this issue obviously of tax evasion, and given the sort of push now, whether or not it's genuine, for corporations to appear to be more involved in communities and sustainability, have you been able to find any corporations that are willing to be partners with you in trying to change some of these issues, or is it inherently always a combative relationship with the private sector?
Thank you very much. Shall I take those two for now? So the first one is what keeps me awake at night, Priya, on the fundraising. It's a very difficult environment. To be honest, I don't really have any answers on that. And let me give a small example. There's a new fundraising regulator that has been set up by the current government, and they've started working, which means that it's going to be increasingly more difficult for us to raise funds from the general public. We have many organizations like ActionAid have had a strong relationship with DFID, the Department for International Development, and we have had a strategic grant which we all love because that's strategic and is flexible and is unrestricted. That mechanism is going to come to an end by the end of this year, and we don't know what's going to be replaced. So we are all in the frame together. If any of you have any bright ideas, I'll most generously welcome them. But that's precisely where some of the challenge is. So one thing that we're doing is to work as a collective. There are organizations and we are part of those organizations that are networks. So there's an organization called BOND, which is for all the agencies in international development. There is something called NCVO, which is the National Council for Voluntary Organization. So trying to work as a collective so that we can continue to lobby and advocate with the government on some of the more restrictive regulations that might be put in place that therefore significantly impacts on our ability to fundraise. But we need to widen the dialogue as well. We need to be we need to look at the role of digital and technology in getting the messages across. A lot of our work is campaigning work, and they are complex messages. So how do we make the complex messages very engaging so that we get youth, we get the wider public to participate in those messages? So those are all questions that do exercise. There aren't any easy answers, unfortunately, other than being much more, shall I say, articulate in conveying the complexity of some of the most structural causes of poverty in a manner that can be understood by the general public who are not, as closely associated with international development. On the point on tax and corporations and are they being combative or not, I was in a discussion yesterday with a company that shall remain unnamed for various reasons. One of the very interesting discussions we had was the gap between the legal imperative and the moral imperative. So when you talk to many companies about tax, they would say that we are legally compliant, and they're probably very, very true, because nobody asked them not to have their headquarters in Ireland because Ireland has got the lowest levels of corporation tax. No, it's legally, it's not wrong. Probably, and I'm not defending Facebook because I'm a Facebook fan or whatever, probably, legally it's fine for Facebook to pay £4,000 as tax. But is that right morally? So one of the questions that then, so what this person was saying is that as we are fine as long as we are on the legally right side. What we are trying to do is to also bring them, so first of all question that, is how legal is legal? And what are the incentives that are there in the system to keep corporations at such low levels of taxation and for them to get away with it? There was a very interesting film that came on Channel 4. It was a documentary done by, I think his name is Greg, Emma Thompson's husband, the actress Emma Thompson. Her husband actually did an undercover story on taxation, and it was fascinating. If you Google that, you'll get it, because it was shown just 2 weeks ago. What is interesting is that London offers a huge network of financial and legal services who can actually help you make the illegal legal. Let's put it that way. There are ways in which loopholes can be found that can help you tick the legal boxes and actually make you think that you're doing the right thing. But then, is that right? Or should something happen about those kind of systems at a time when there's so much of discussion on poverty and inequality in this country as well? So it's not just something that's happening in other places. The government is feeling increasingly pressurized. That's why you have got cuts. That's why the poorest people are facing the impact of that. Is it right? So it's something that needs to be looked at more broadly. What's the government's responsibility in ensuring fairness? So if there's one thing that can cover the gap between what's legally right and what's a moral imperative, is the principle of fairness. Is it fair for the government to have regulations, systems, and mechanisms that enable the better resourced companies to get away by doing so little when it comes to taxation? How is it being seen by the corporations? I think that at least in a small section of the corporations, they are waking up to it. Of course, what they're battling with is that what is in it for the shareholders? Why would they want their company to pay more taxes, which means less profits, which means less dividend? So there's a whole discussion around corporate behavior, but there's also a bigger discussion around how do you change attitudes of the general public so that it's not just about the money, but about doing the right thing. So I'm sorry, there is no real direct answer to your question, but it's a long journey.
And we had one final question.
I wanted to ask about the accountability dimension. I don't understand, how do you think the SDGs provide a new dimension for accountability? I mean, how the governments are accountable for whom, and how do you think that this is really applicable in very poor countries where very basic accountability mechanisms are not even present? I mean, who was accountable for the MDGs, for example?
Very good question. And I think if one of the reasons why MDGs did not even take off in many of these countries is because the accountability mechanisms were just not there. I mean, we've just seen in Uganda that the government, the president who has been there for 30 years has just been re-elected. You've seen Mugabe celebrating his 92nd birthday in Zimbabwe and still going very strong after all these years. So there are always questions about, these are countries which are not quite delivered on many of their promises, but what's holding them accountable when it doesn't seem to have any impact on the political careers of their leaders. And that's where the role of civil society really kicks in. And I think that's where we also need to think very strongly about what's the role that civil society can and should be playing. So equally, it's, I would say, a failure of civil society to engage with governments, to engage with the public, to create that groundswell of a political atmosphere where it's not just about NGOs providing services, which is very, very important, but it's also about how do they accompany and work with local communities to build their confidence, to build the solidarity, so that it becomes it has to become a movement. It has to become a movement across youth, across trade unions, across women's organizations, to actually raise the voice. And there are cases where people have raised the voice. And I, for a couple of years ago, visited Kampala, the capital of Uganda, and there just one community or a section of a community had been working so long for in such a focused manner and in a confident manner that they managed to get water and sanitation services into those communities. But building on that confidence, they then got roads and electricity coming into the community. So there are examples, but they're few and far in between. And there's a case for civil society to focus much more on that, so that they create they push the boundaries and make governments actually stand up. In the run-up to the SDGs and the high-level panels, one of the things that I was very impressed with was the African youth across several countries, and who are really rising up to the challenge and saying that they really need to push the boundaries, because I think the voice that we are hearing, enough is enough. We really need a paradigm shift in how governments perform.
Thank you very much. Please thank our wonderful keynote, Girish Menon.